In the spring semester, I taught a course, Post-Colonial Theory and Theology, for PhD students at Emory University. The war at Gaza provided the backdrop for the discussion of Edward Said's work. In April, you have heard earlier Mildred telling you about what happened on the campus of Emory University. On April 25th, there was a group of people who wanted to set up an encampment at the quad of the university. The president decided to stop the encampment from happening. And that is why the police came and arrested 28 people, 20 of them Emory students, including 2 from Canberra School of Theology. When that happened, some of the students studying theology and religion, as well as Canberra students, they initiated occupied Canberra. That is, they wanted to use the building, Canberra School of Theology, as a place to provide hospitality and pastoral care for the demonstrators, because the demonstration continued. I want to also share with you the faculty of Emory University voted no confidence in the president because of that decision to call in the police. The faculty of Canberra School of Theology voted to censor the president and the university administration for that decision. While all this was going on, some of the students who took my course participated in the protest and provide support for the protesters. They told me, Professor Kwok, we are putting what we learned in your course into practice. As a post-colonial theologian who grew up in the Anglican Church in Hong Kong, Edward Said's scholarship and activism for the Palestinian people had a great impact on me. I want to share with you today the impact of this genocidal war and propose a common theological agenda for theologians from the Global South. I do not need to remind you, Global South is not a geographical conceptualization. It is rather a political construct. People who speak against the domination of the North and formed movements of resistance. Mr. Rahab has invited us to use the lens of settler colonialism to interpret the Bible and what is happening in Palestine. I want to foster a dialogue between those who have experienced settler colonialism and external colonialism. When I was doing research for this paper, I find, unfortunately, there were not sufficient substantial scholarship coming from the Global South on the Palestine question. That is why I decided to interview and asked my friends in Asia and Africa to share with me what the churches in their respective communities have been saying and what they think about the Palestinian issue. I just want to report briefly on what I heard before naming 3 particular issues for a common theological agenda for theologians from the Global South. From Asia, I heard that some countries, they were actively involved in voicing opposition to the war in Gaza, especially coming from Malaysia and Indonesia. But many of those faith communities and churches did not speak very loudly across Asia. Yes, the churches, for example, in Korea, issue a statement calling for peace and, of course, to pray for victims, for those who experienced violence and abuses. Some of these churches also supported the World Council of Churches statement. We are asserting international law as the foundation of this conflict between Israel and Palestine. The churches in Africa reacted differently according to their particular historical and social situations. Many of us know that the churches in South Africa has stood in solidarity with Palestinian people for decades. The late Archbishop Desmond Tutu compared the Palestinian issue with apartheid in South Africa. Archbishop Tapo Magoba, the current Archbishop, issued a statement last October calling for ceasefire and the release of the hostages. He said, the war certainly was causing a lot of conflicts, and he asked the churches to pray for peace. And the occupation of West Bank and the Jordan has to be ended, and the Palestinians given the rights of self-determination there and in Gaza. Equally, the Archbishop says, Israelis need to be able to live in peace and security. But what about the other African churches? We did not hear much about what they have to say. According to Kenyan theologian Esther Mambo, there are several reasons why other African churches remained quite quiet. First, she said, the churches do not want to take sides. Second, they think that the issue in the Middle East, particularly the Israel and Palestinian conflict, is very complex, very difficult to determine the situation. And then they were preoccupied with their internal struggles and difficulties in their respective countries. They have no time or energy to engage with what is happening in the Middle East. But last, but not the least, is the Christian Zionism. That is, many of the faith community leaders, they followed a rather Zionist interpretation of the Bible, thinking that it is what the Bible has said, that the Jews would be going back to their homeland, and so this affected the African responses. So now I want to move on to suggest 3 agenda items for theologians of the Global South to think about. The first, I think it is important to look at Gaza in the changing geopolitics of the world. The Southern theologians have not spoken loud and clearly because they think they have no skin in the game. Now, I want to counteract that idea to argue everyone has skin in the game. I have read the Bible as post-colonial literature because it talks about a people in defeat, in exile, diaspora, and forced to live under the domination of various empires. So from this particular perspective, we need to look at Palestine as a litmus test for human rights, international law, and for whether the West can be decolonized, ending the duplicity and complicity. It is not only this as the litmus test for human rights issue, I am beginning to also see Gaza has become a symbol of necropolitics, according to the Cameroon theorist Achille Mbembe. The war in Ukraine, Gaza, and the possible war in Taiwan indicates a changing political situation the world is facing together. It is called a heightened great power rivalry in its most naked form. The water wars, the blockade, starvation, deprivation of basic needs, and the genocidal war all should be regarded expressions of this necropolitics. In the competitions of these big powers, I'm naming the United States, Russia, and China. Let us not forget, China in the past has not been so much involved in the Middle East, not now. So then, when we look at Gaza through this particular lens, I would like to propose two other issues that we need to deal with. My colleague Jacob Wright has written, throughout history, defeated and colonized populations have often imagined as peoples and nations by looking at the biblical model of Israel. In his very important book, War, Memory, and National Identity in the Hebrew Bible, he argues that the memories of war has shaped the national consciousness of Israelites as a people. Given the war in Gaza, how would we remember this incident and, of course, the past wars, and how this memory of retelling the history will shape our collective consciousness in our resistance to what I call this necropolitics of big power rivalry. Several of us already talked about, both in the United States and Europe, there is this strong repression of telling the truth. You will be labeled anti-Semites. You will be labeled self-hating Jews. Collectively, how we as humanity remember the war in Gaza, theology after Gaza, will shape our collective consciousness as a people on this particular planet and our relationship to ecocide. So my last theological agenda is how to talk about resistance, if not solidarity. Here I learned from Judith Butler in Parting Ways. She talks about a democratic vision of radical cohabitation, talking about the Jews has always needed to redefine its own identity, Jewish identity, vis-a-vis the environment. So she called this cohabitation. How can we find a model? I want to expand it a little bit more. The theological agenda should be how to find a collective effort of movement for a radical democratic vision of cohabitability. Because it's not just cohabitation, it is also to make it habitable. Gaza today, obviously, is very difficult to inhabit because of the destruction of buildings, infrastructures. When we then look at the planet as a whole, talking about the water wars, the controlling of basic necessities of human living and flourishing, the question is whether together we, as people resisting the big empires, can come up with new visions for cohabitability. So I hope in these 2 days we will have opportunities to discuss those three things that I mentioned. One, I see Gaza as the symbol of big power rivalry. Second, how do we talk about the war and how it will shape our collective consciousness? Three, what is the possibility of thinking a movement so that together, in our various locations and places, we can work towards a democratic vision of cohabitability? Thank you.